We are reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary of the last two verses of the Kena, and in these two verses, the Kena has finished giving the guidance and the knowledge that it had begun, and in the typical style of these Upanishadic texts, it gives you a summary and an essential foundation of what you need in order to put into practice what has been revealed and what is the benefit or result of this knowledge being acquired. So the first of these two verses we had already read in Sri Aurobindo's translation. Of this knowledge, tapas, austerity, and dhamma, self-conquest, and karma, works, are the foundation. The Vedas are its limbs. Truth is its dwelling place. We went in some detail last time on each of these three things: tapas, dhamma, and karma. What is meant by this poise of a gathered, concentrated direction of our energies towards realizing that the self-conquest, that is the overcoming of the tendencies of our nature or habits or instincts, which are either contrary to that or which turn our steps away from that. And therefore, in the very process of the self-conquest and overcoming of our starting base and its development, its evolution, its transformation into a higher, diviner consciousness and being. This is the sense of the self-conquest. And then the works. We saw how the works themselves here represent a process of self-mastery through action in the world. These three things represent the foundation. But after the foundation is set, there are the limbs. What do you do from this foundation? And we saw how these revealed verses, Vedas, are the limbs which grow out of this foundation. And finally, the thing into which it leads us, that poise of consciousness into which we awaken, in which we dwell, that is the truth as the dwelling place. Now, these three things represent broadly three stages of the movement of the sadhana. In the beginning, there is almost as if a basic foundation being developed, which makes possible the whole sadhana. Inevitably, you will see in every spiritual tradition, there is a preparatory phase. Often it is presented to us in a very mechanical, dreary, repetitive form. You must do so many asanas, you must do so many pranayams, you must wake up at this time, you must eat this kind of food, sleep in this way, and so on. Study these texts, serve in these particular ways. And if you look at the underlying intention behind all these, it is to create a basic poise of self-control and a redirection of our energies towards the goal for which the whole process has been begun. It is to create a basic foundation in which you will have a capacity to do the rest. In itself, those things have no value other than creating a basis. Those who, unfortunately, take the preparatory steps themselves as the path remain stuck there for the rest of their lives. Often these may involve practices which are presented as advanced. So you repeat a mantra so many times, and then eventually you will get the result. But you may repeat all you want. The repetition only makes your mind focus on the counting and not on the thing on which the mantra dwells. At some point, once you have learned the mantra, you have to turn the mind, the mantra, the man part of it has to be directed to the goal. And that becomes now the second stage. And you will see in this second stage, the description is the Vedas are all its limbs. That is here in the context of this Kena, Upanishad. All the revealed verses which are of the same Vedic kind of inspiration, they are the limbs, and by dwelling on them, by entering deep into them, by concentrating on them with the capacity now developed by the Tapas, you begin to have contact with the truth that they represent. You begin gradually to reshape your mind, reshape your thoughts, align your tendencies, and make a forward movement of the change of consciousness. This is when the sadhana proper begins, for which the foundation had earlier been laid. And then there is a third stage, where truth is its dwelling place. Where at first you perceived the truth by reflection, your contact with the truth was through several indirect steps. Reflection of a reflection of a reflection still. Where you glimpsed the truth through your now partially awakened senses or your higher ranges of the mind's conception, or something of your heart's longing or the heart's devotion. Where so far the truth was glimpsed, now you are able to reach the truth, enter into contact with it directly, even if not the whole of the truth. But the direct contact already made is a first point of contact through which gradually the access grows, and as we enter in contact with it, we turn into its terms, we grow into its image, we are transformed by its influence until we enter into this dwelling place. We become one with it. It merges into us, we merge into it. And this is the culmination of the sadhana. But this phase also may have many degrees. It is again popularly misunderstood when terms are taught in various traditions of the goal. They will speak of nirvana, they will speak of ananda, they will speak of the svarga loka, the heavenly realms, or the domain of immortality, which is to be attained, to be realized. And the error the mind makes is to think of it as a step that you get into and it's done. You have attained nirvana and it's done. But if you enter deeper into the esoteric traditions, you discover that having entered into it, we discover that there are still further degrees of its perfection, of its completeness. And so the higher path of the sadhana, which is rarely discussed in the beginning because we would not even understand until we begin to glimpse in experience, that higher phase has its own journey, but of a very different kind. In the Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo describes the journey of the yoga broadly as having two phases. In the first phase, we have to make effort. There is a struggle because we do not yet have contact with the thing in itself. But once that contact is made, the second phase, because you've already made a contact, the second phase of the journey is the growing of that contact. And that he discusses the struggle, but as a joy growing into greater joy, light growing into greater light, and experience becoming more and more complete. And so the second phase is always, even if in the first phase we had some struggles and some ups and downs and variations of contraries. And so it is to this second phase that we see here the description of the dwelling in the truth. These three, Sri Aurobindo summarizes in a single movement as one whole journey in the sentence at the end of the paragraph that we studied last time. He puts it this way: it is by these means, by using works and self-discipline for mastery of oneself and for the generation of spiritual energy, by fathoming in all its parts the truth and repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers, and by living in the truth, that one becomes capable of the great ascent which the Upanishad opens to us. So he has described the three phases. The first phase of the foundation he describes as using works and self-discipline for mastery of oneself and for the generation of spiritual energy, the tapas. And this is critical because in the phrasing he uses, generation of spiritual energy, in the act of that concentration, in the act of that dedication, when we direct all our energies, the intensification that takes place creates precisely in us a condition that allows us to enter in contact with the truth. And this condition is a condition of energy which can actually be felt as substantial. The tapas is then described almost as if something which you gather, which you acquire, which you preserve, and then direct and apply towards the realization. So, generation of spiritual energy, it is as if you've built up this energy which now gives you the capacity to make the leap or to enter the realization. And this is a fact of experience. You take an example of a person, and it need not be in spiritual life. Let's say a person who has dedicated himself to achieving a very material result in sports, in business, in arts. So it may be I am preparing for the Olympics in order to make this perfect somersault and backflip. What do? You gather all your awareness into a one-pointed focus. From the point you wake up from sleep, the entire day, all your efforts of training, all your thoughts, all your energies are directed in a one-pointed concentration to develop and perfect this skill. If in the midst of this, you take a break, your friends invite you to have some fun, to go to a party, to watch a movie, all experiences which tend to dissipate your energies or to dissolve the gathered focus. You may go there and then you come back and you find somehow you've lost that state of poise, of gathered concentration in which all your awareness was one-pointed. And now suddenly all the threads of awareness have scattered, spread out, and the energy is as if lost. And it's a very distinct experience. In the same way, a painter, an artist, in a concentration, working on something, a project which may take perhaps days or weeks to complete, taking a break is not in itself a problem, but a break in which you dissipate your energies and you come back and you can feel as if you have lost the thread of the inspiration. Somehow the push which was there, which was articulating itself through you, is gone. The energy is lost. You have at best a mental idea, but you do not have anymore the link with the thing which was being expressed. Or somebody the same way with business, driving for that purpose. You will recall, we mentioned last time Swami Vivekananda's guideline that you must hold on to the single idea and think and feel and eat and sleep and direct all of yourself to that as the secret for success. But this state of one-pointed gathering is actually an accumulated energy. The energy contains in itself the power to lead you to that for which you have gathered the energy. And this is the importance of tapas. And so Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, generation of spiritual energy, when it is directed for a spiritual goal. This gathered energy can in fact be given because it is substantial. The Guru, who may have a much greater quantum of that gathered energy, held in his experience, the disciple feels somehow suddenly uplifted. The things being spoken of, the things being read or studied, suddenly become vivid and intense and are felt as if accessible, tangible even, as long as the energy is intact. When that energy is dissipated, suddenly, I remember it felt great, but now I do not feel it anymore. This is what the mother and Sri Aurobindo used to do when they met the disciples, particularly in the early days of the ashram. In the beginning, at the beginning of the day, when the mother would give the darshan, the disciples would stand at the balcony and receive the energy that she poured into you. The result was something sustained you through the day. You rarely felt tired. And the one-pointed concentration on the divine was easy to keep. Of course, if you dissipated, you could feel it lost. If you didn't receive it at the beginning of the day, then you found it was much more difficult to do. So obviously something was given which was substantial, which could be transmitted, which could be held or which could be lost. And this is the tapas, the spiritual energy, which is so valued in the spiritual tradition. This is generated by this concentration. So, by these means, first, using works and self-discipline for mastery of oneself and for the generation of spiritual energy. Both works and self-discipline are used for self-mastery and for this generation of tapas. Next, by fathoming in all its parts the knowledge and repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers. This is the second stage. Fathoming in all its parts the knowledge and repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers. So the phrasing Sri Aurobindo uses is so suggestive. As a master of language, every word he uses carries behind it the full import of the etymology, the origin, the history of the word. Remember, Sri Aurobindo was a master of Greek and Latin, including ancient Greek. He wrote poetry in ancient Greek during his teen years. Knowing Latin and Greek together gave him the basis for all the modern European languages in their roots and etymology. He had exposure to Sanskrit, and having read the Upanishads also, at least to some degree in those years, the sense of the deeper root sounds were also there. And so when we find a word like this, fathom, fathoming in all its parts the knowledge, we have to look at what's behind the word. And in its most obvious usage today, it is the sense of depth in the waters. The nautical language, when ships travel the oceans, they have a different sense of measure. They do not measure things in miles or kilometers. They have a different measure because of the nature of the waters and the currents. And so they have nautical miles, which have a different sense. But equally, when they measure the depths, they use the fathom as a measure. And the fathom is the sense of the arm extended fully and has a particular extension, a particular length associated to it. They say 6 feet. But the vocabulary then takes this form that you measure the depth of the waters, and that measurement is described as fathoming the waters. Now, you see where this sense merges. Fathom has the sense of the arm extended. You are on the waters of the ocean and you measure the depth of the ocean. It's as if you're reaching out to grasp the deep. But the sense of depth and the measuring of the depth leading to the grasping of the depth, that's the overall sense of the etymology. There is another phrase which is plumb the depths. In the nautical vocabulary, they will drop a rope with a weight and let the rope reach the bottom and pull it back. And you measure on the rope how deep it was. That is called plumbing. But this is not plumbing, this is fathoming. So it's not you put out something which came back. You reach out to grasp the depths so that you may have them. You may be one with them. You may be identified with what you have grasped. So the sense of fathoming here is very special. By fathoming in all its parts the knowledge. So the knowledge is multifaceted. And each of its facets must be fathomed. And to grasp in depth the full spectrum, the full range of all these facets. In the suggestion, in the verse itself, when it says the Vedas are its limbs, these Vedic revelatory verses are the limbs. So it's as if the sense is, each of these revealed verses is as if a limb of your arm reaching out to fathom and grasp, and the next verse, fathom and grasp, and the next, until the full revelation in all its facets becomes as if all the limbs reaching out to grasp in depth. The suggestion is very important in the Vedic and Upanishadic texts, because the truth which is being articulated is too profound to be fully expressed in form of words and ideas. And so words and ideas are lifted to the highest that they can be as pointers to the truth. And so as you read, the suggestions come in your mind and they're intended to guide your mind. So when we look at the etymology and the way the phrasing is there, very distinctly there is the sense of grasping the depth of each of these words until you become one with this multifaceted knowledge. So by fathoming in all its parts the knowledge. And in the process, what are you doing? Repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers. They are the ones revealing what they already hold. And as they reveal to you, they also convey something of their energy, of the realization, the tapas, which can be transmitted by the Guru. We as disciples of the Kena Upanishad receive from the Rishi the illumination of his own experience. And therefore we repeat in ourselves the high example of the great Vedic seers. The word seer, Rishi, because they see. They know the knowledge not as a mental idea, but in the vision in which they are one with what they see. And so we are to be raised into that poise of consciousness in which we also can begin to see and experience the oneness with them in their vision and experience. So we are repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers. Elsewhere in the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo uses the same phrase, explaining how the higher consciousness multiplies itself. And he gives this example. On every level of consciousness, there is the process of self-replication, of multiplication. At a physical level, every living being gives birth to another living form, as if replicating itself, but always with some difference. The best of you is put out as you give birth. Mother makes this observation often She says, in childbirth, the best that is in the mother can be put out, but often it is the worst that is put out because, well, that's what you are holding in a unconscious, impulsive birth. But the intention is, of course, that we replicate ourselves physically, though that's all that you have, which is an instinctive process. But then Sri Aurobindo says the same thing happens in the mind. What we know in ideas, we want to replicate, we want to share. And this is what happens in the school, where a teacher gives his knowledge, or at home, or any other context. But the nature of the knowledge also wants to replicate itself, to repeat, to spread. And again, in the receiving vehicle, it is an imprint, but always different. And it spreads. But he says the same thing happens in the spiritual consciousness. The spiritual consciousness also, as it receives an experience and grows into something, it wants to replicate, to spread itself, to spread into the universe. And it is this movement which is the sharing of the experience. And this is the point he's referring to when he says, repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers, they share their experience, we receive from them as if we are born into a new consciousness, and we become, as their disciples, we become vehicles in which that realization can spread into humanity. And by this, one becomes capable of the great ascent. And one more step. And by living in the truth, that's the third step. Increasingly, as this truth begins to dawn in us, we live more and more in it until we become one with it. So, it is by these means, by using works and self-discipline for mastery of oneself and for generation of spiritual energy, by fathoming in all its parts the knowledge and repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers, and by living in the truth, that one becomes capable of the great ascent which the Upanishad opens to us. And the whole journey is this movement of an ascent of the consciousness, which the Upanishad has revealed. But by these three things, one becomes capable of the great ascent. The ascent itself is the purpose of this revelation. But what is the ascent leading us to? What is attained by doing this? And so we come to the last verse of the Kena, verse 9 of the 4th chapter. He who knows this knowledge smites evil away from him, and in that vaster world and infinite heaven finds his foundation, yea, he finds his foundation. This is Sri Aurobindo's translation. In the verse, the word used for knowledge is Veda. And Veda has the specific connotation of knowledge which is realized, not mental knowledge, but an experiential knowledge. And the phrase used, which Sri Aurobindo translates as vaster world and infinite heaven, is Svarge Loke. Loka is domain or plane of consciousness, state of consciousness in which we live, and Svarga is the heavenly state of consciousness. But Sri Aurobindo will, in his commentary, explain what exactly this Svarga is, because unfortunately we find over time the same word used in different contexts to represent different levels of consciousness. But basically the idea is you live in this infinite, heavenly, vaster state of consciousness. It does not mean you abandon the body. Living in the world, in the physical body, your consciousness is in this higher poise than the mind. And the last, which Sri Aurobindo translates as finds his foundation, yea, he finds his foundation. In the Sanskrit, Pratitishtati, Pratitishtati. The phrase is repeated twice, and the sense of the repetition is always an exclamation, an exultation of joy. Pratitishthati, pratitishthati. Sri Aurobindo translates as finds his foundation, yea, he finds his foundation. But pratitishthati, you will recall when we ended last time, we spoke of the word pratishtha, was the word used for foundation of tapas, dhamma and kara. Pratishtha, revealed basis, literally, prati and stha, revealed basis. But here it is not the same word. Pratitishthati has the sense of revealed state of being. Tishtati being static, poised, established in, but not moving from. Tishtha is wait, stay, be in the same poise. So Prati, in this revealed state of awareness, he is based, founded. No more the possibility of being shaken, no more the possibility of form, of falling. It is not anymore an unstable poise, it is a realized base. And twice the repetition has the confirmation, the affirmation and the exclamation. To this, Sri Aurobindo's commentary, and he goes deep into the vocabulary and the sense of it. The goal of the ascent is the world of the true and vast existence, of which the Veda speaks as the truth, Satyam. That is the final goal and home of man. It is described here as the great, infinite, heavenly world, Svarga Loka or Swar Loka of the Veda, which is not the lesser Svarga of the Puranas or the lesser Brahma Loka of the Mundaka Upanishad. It's world of the sun's rays in which the soul arrives by works of virtue and piety, but falls from them by the exhaustion of their merit. So it is not these. It is the higher Svarga or Brahman world of the Katha, which is beyond the dual symbols of death, of birth and death, the higher Brahman worlds of the Mundaka, which the soul enters by knowledge and renunciation. So straight away, in this simple for this one word, he has made references to 3 texts. And if he takes the trouble to reference them, we will also take time to briefly explore, however briefly, to understand the importance of this distinction. So first it says, the goal of the ascent is the world of the true and vast existence. True, we saw last time the sense of it. It exists by itself. It is not dependent on something else. That which is dependent on something else is modified when the other thing is modified. My emotions are dependent on what people say, and so they are unstable. My sense of identity is a reflection of the social respect that I have, and therefore it is unstable. I cannot be master of myself when my existence is dependent on other things which fluctuate. And therefore this is as unreal as that. So reality, the sense of being true, is the sense of being, of existing in itself and by itself without reference to anything else. When your existence is by reference to yourself, that is a true existence because it stands on its own. Everything else may then be modified in terms of this. And so, what in our personality is true? Our biology changes, is dependent on the food and the circumstances we eat, of our health. Our life energies similarly fluctuate. We are constantly dependent on sources to take in, and we lose if we do not take in. Our mind similarly is almost a public space in which thoughts enter from outside and wander through. Even if we go deeper to some poise of stillness and silence within, that is still precarious. You can be shocked out of it. The only thing which is true and stable in itself, not dependent on anything else, is the pure consciousness of the soul, which is not born by circumstances and therefore cannot die by circumstances. It exists, simply is. And so when we plunge deep within ourselves and have some reflected glimpse of it, the experience is of a profound stability, a sense of permanence, or a sense of immortality, and a great sense of freedom. Somehow you know, whatever may happen in my life, I am secure, I will be fulfilled, I will realize what I am meant to. All of this simply comes from that brief reflected contact with the presence of the soul. And of course, if we plunge deeper into it, this grows, this becomes stable, and then this becomes the foundation on which everything else in your mind and emotions and body can draw strength from and be secure in life. So I'm referring to this because in our human experience, this is the first experience we have of something which is true. But we discover also, as there are higher planes of consciousness, there is such a thing as a state of consciousness which is true in itself. It exists because it is its own absolute, against which all these lower states of consciousness find their fulfillment and of which they are relative expressions. And so just as inward we find this, upward also we find a poise of consciousness. And if it is a poise of consciousness which is itself infinite, it is a world in itself. So the world of the true and the vast. In the Veda, because he references it, he says, of which the Veda speaks as the truth, Satyam. The Veda associates this word with three terms, Satyam, Ritam and Brihat. Sri Aurobindo comments on these repeatedly. So the truth is, first of all, self-existent. It is what it is. But it is not static. It has a great power of infinite possibilities of being. Just as we go deep within ourselves and discover our soul in its essence, in its like a seed of a potentiality, but we discover in it infinite potentiality. It could become everything, unendingly. And so this poise of truth, Satyam, is also infinite potential, and being infinite potential, it reveals itself, unfolds itself, and this unfolding movement of the truth is the Ritam. The equivalent idea in the Chinese tradition is the Tao or Tao. Tao is not the same as the Satyam. It is not the same as it is not the same as dharma. It has clearly a sense of an unfolding in form, and the unfolding movement of this form has a natural and spontaneous process. When you are aligned to it, you are part of a natural, effortless unfolding. When you are out of alignment with it, everything you do experiences a bump, difficulties, conflicts, contradictions, because you are not in sync with the natural unfolding. So this unfolding movement of the truth is the second aspect, Ritam. But it conveys the same sense of the truth as it flows to become. What was being is now becoming. And there's a third facet to this, Brihat. Vast, immense, infinite, or Mahas as the supermind, the form of it. And so these three terms, essential truth because it is self-existent, absolute in itself, unfolding as the Ritam, becoming the rhythms of manifestation, again effortless and true in themselves, and Brihat containing infinite possibility, infinite potential, unfolding that infinite possibility in the play. And nothing is limited. All is full of infinite possibilities. And so these three terms define that domain. So the goal of the ascent is the world of the true and vast existence of which the Vedas speaks as the truth. And this is our journey. And this, he says, that is the final goal and home of man. So we have now two terms to describe this for our relationship of our journey of life. It is the goal of our journey of life. Not just of this life, but across all the lives, the soul journeying is aiming to that. But it does not aim to that by getting out of life. It aims to that by fulfilling life. Meaning, we realize that consciousness here in the body, in the form. Not by getting out of this. So the soul is journeying and therefore will inevitably reach it. But our relationship is not something which is far away, which we have to attain, which we are not. Rather, the relationship is that it is already the home of man. And the suggestion, it has two ways of looking at it in the Vedic symbolism. It is the home from which we came in order to enter this journey. But it is also the home because we always live in it. We never really lose our poise in it. And that's the sense of home. See, when you wander away, you travel out of your house, from your home, go elsewhere, experience things, and you come back home. When you come back, you discover you never really left. Because everything that is yours was always there. Your roots were there. It's as if a part of you projected out to wander and to experience, and now came back to what it always was, where it always was. And that's the sense of home. Otherwise it's house. I came to my house, but that's not home. Home is what you come back to because you were always there. You never left it. And so the sense of the relationship with that is, that's where we lived as in our divine origin. From there we have as if emerged as an emanation, as a soul, to enter this experience of the journey, growing in form, overcoming our limitations, developing from self-loss to recovering in our self-discovery, our divinity and divine potential, and unfolding that potential, until at some point we discover that we live once again, or we have returned to that. But always the sense of return brings to the human mind the idea that you have got out of this cycle of birth and death. Meaning you are now no more in the birth. This suggestion comes from the ascetic traditions hammering away in humanity for 2000 years, at least. The idea that the divine is outside the world, and to realize the divine you have to leave the world. But in the Vedic vocabulary, and here in the texts we are reading, and the reference Sri Aurobindo makes to the higher world of the Mundaka, it is the poise in which you are beyond both birth and death. So you are not bound to death either. You are not bound to birth either. That means you live equally in all the worlds freely. Meaning practically, if your journey began in the progression of births, then the fulfillment is in the life. But in a poise of consciousness which is not bound to these processes and stages of life unfolding, and is therefore able to assert its freedom in life. Live in the consciousness of Svarga and express it in the universe. So you've come home here, not by abandonment of this. The fulfillment of the life is the aim of the Veda. The divinization of life is what leads us to living in this truth as our home. In the journey of the gods, the Vedas use this vocabulary. the gods, though they are originating in that domain, they enter for their purpose of action in the levels of consciousness which are inferior, which are not their home. They operate there as secondary or even sometimes tertiary powers. They operate in a concealed way. But through their operation, what do? They progress and awaken here the terms of their home. Until by that awakening process, they have grown and returned home and achieved that, living in their own world, in their own home, Svedame. So Agni, for example, as the divine will embedded inside matter, works to build forms. It creates the biological basis, awakens in the biological basis the life energies, awakens in the life energies the mind. And so Agni is ascending in his journey by creating forms, vehicles for the embodiment of what? Of the consciousness of his home. And the culmination of this is when he reaches his home. Where? Right here. In the evolution of our consciousness, we have realized now that which was always ours, but here. So there is nowhere in the Vedic sense of Agni's journey the sense that he's built up a form so that he may escape from the form, which would be ridiculous. He's built up a form so that he may express and realize and live in his home, that is the consciousness of the Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, here. So this is the sense of the final goal and home of man is the truth that the Veda speaks, and this is the goal of the ascent. It is here described as the great infinite world, Svarga Loka, Svaraloka of the Veda. Unfortunately, we find the same term, because it was used in the Veda in this sense, subsequently, at the various stages of the unfolding of knowledge in humanity, there is always a kind of a degeneration of the context, necessary so that the human mind can acquire some understanding of it. If you take, for example, a text of physics, which is very arcane, the modern interpretations of quantum physics, and there are many schools and many interpretations and specializations of quantum physics theories themselves, quantum chromodynamics and quantum, and many interpretations of each. The common man who does not have the background of physics will say, well, what is this? I do not understand. And so you have the interpretation or the simplification which is given, which sounds fantastic, which is unbelievable. Well, quantum physics says that you can separate two particles, you flip one and the other will flip automatically with nothing in between. Wow, that's crazy. That's the common man's understanding of it. And so you give it a term and you say, this is the paradox, and you give it various names. But what you have understood is a simplified form of what is otherwise a very complex theory, which your mind perhaps is not trained to be able to fully engage, or where your vocabulary is not familiar with. And so you have a simplified form. The simplified form prepares the mind to grasp something higher, or gives the mind an access even partially to this higher possibility. And if this was not done, there could not be the next step where the mind actually now goes deeper and acquires a deeper understanding. So in practice, we find all evolutionary unfolding has paradoxically a movement of self-loss, a dilution, in order that humanity can grow. So the way we see it in the 4 stages of the cycle of the yugas, Sri Aurobindo explains how. First, there is this high peak of the period of the Satya Yuga, in which we live, or a part of humanity lives in that consciousness, revealed, effortless. Gradually though, that has to decline, or it has to spread, it has to enter into the rest of the consciousness which does not participate in it. And quickly there is a gap of what was spontaneously a truth, there's a gap, and now we cling to the truth by force of will. And so we force ourselves to do something. We move to the third stage where our will has broken down, and so we compel the truth by social structures and organization of society. And each of those now represents that truth which was a living experience by a procedure, by a form, by a ritual, by an exercise. And you have reduced it to symbols. You no more have the living truth. And of course that helps a long way until eventually we disconnect even from the meaning of the symbols. We as if lose them, they become hollow. And we say, why are we doing this silly rituals and processes and activities? Break it. Let's live what is true. And we go back to a introspection of what is it that is our innate truth. And the plunging deep to find ourselves leads eventually to a recovery of a truth, which becomes again the spontaneous revealed truth and the new Satya Yuga. And again from there a gap forms, and again the three stages of dilution. And so repeatedly we have this recovery of the truth and its dilution, so that the parts which do not share in it can find some diluted contact with it. And then the recovery allows that part to participate more. And so Sri Aurobindo says it's a spiral, not a mechanical circle repeating, a spiral that each time we make the effort, everything within us rises a little more and a little more closer to that. Until there is a point in the spiral where it is actually possible to make a great leap, and all of our being could potentially realize that. Practically it would mean after that there is no more the need for this fourfold stages of loss and recovery and loss and recovery. We are at such a point in the evolution, and this is why this transition is so important. Evolutionary terms, it may take a few thousand years, but still what it represents is in this and through this we will be able to awaken our consciousness sufficiently that there will not be the necessity of this cyclic loss. Now I'm pointing to this because it helps us to understand why the word Swarga is diluted. In the unfolding history of the Vedic tradition, we have the Vedic age in which it is lived, the Rishis live the truth. The common man does not have the same access, but they at least receive some kind of a reflection of the truth. They are given the symbolic language and a symbolic form in which they can relate to the truth through a certain process of a ritual of the Havana, where Agni is represented with the fire and so on. But then comes the second phase in which that which was experienced in a high consciousness now descends through an intuitive passage into the rational mind. And the first transition into the intuitive passage are the early Upanishads, which take the same Vedic vocabulary, perceive them intuitively and articulate them logically, but without losing the power and force of the living intuitive experience. The Isha Upanishad, Kena Upanishad are such. They're not too rational, at least not obviously. Their force is primarily intuitive. The subsequent Upanishads, you will find, they become much more logical and rational. And there they have entered the domain of mind and the intuition is fading. But they use the same vocabulary, but the quality of the experience has become mentalized. And at that point, the Vedic deities, who are cosmic deities, have acquired a mental character. Indra is no more the divine mind, he is now the intellect. And the Agni similarly has acquired a certain force of the will in the mind, and so on. And still it goes on, it declines further, entering the life energies. And passing through the Upanishadic phase of the later Upanishads, which are rational and intellectual, we come into the texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, which are absolutely intellectual in their argument, in their structure and unfolding, with all the links of logic selected, and yet they use the vocabulary of the Vedic. But now, because you have entered the domain of mind, sometimes you need to create new words, because it's not obvious what the Vedas meant by Brahman. So the Gita actually creates a term, Purushottama. the highest poise of the Purusha, and which is transcending both the active and the passive sides. And so a vocabulary which is more appropriate for the mind but still pointing to those experiences is created. The Puranas, meanwhile, are now bringing these very terms and ideas as stories with the gods as human-like figures, playing out human-like roles, even interacting with human beings, and reach them to a level where even a child can hear the story, enjoy it, and be touched by the truth of what the story presents. And this is when you have reached the lowest accessible range of human mind, when a child can hear the story. The beauty of this is, as a child, the story resonates in my heart, a deep truth. As I grow older, the same story awakens in my mind a deeper understanding of life. And as I awaken into a spiritual consciousness, I discover the deep truth behind which was resonating on these levels. And suddenly I approach the Veda with that background, and suddenly I discover this deep knowledge behind. So you have continuum potentially created. Except that when you first brought it to the child's mind and you do not take further steps to rise back to the source, you have images of Indra as a cunning manipulator, as insecure, as always unsteady, which is a perfect description of the human mind when it has not been divinized. Cunning, insecure, it's always wondering what to do. Will I lose my position and strength or power, my domination, and so on. He is easily tricked. He is always busy trying to trick others, and so on. This is the lower mind working. But the lower mind, remember, is a representation of the higher mind, which is a representation of the divine mind. And so the continuum is there behind, except we don't see it when we look only at these forms. And so this is the problem with the vocabulary now being used on lower levels. This world, Sri Aurobindo says, is described as the great infinite heavenly world, Svarga Loka, Svarloka of the Veda, which is not the lesser Svarga of the Puranas. So in the Puranas, Indra is living in his Svarga, and the heaven is made up of Indra as the king of the gods, and all the gods are seated around him. You will see this represented in movies. The gods are seated on their thrones next to him, and then there are the great dancers, the Apsaras, who are dancing before him. And every now and then there's a rishi on earth who has built up his tapas so much that Indra's throne shakes. You see what happens? The spiritual tapas built up shakes the power of the intellect. Suddenly we realize, oh, the intellect, that's not our greatest power of knowledge. While so far it was your greatest power of knowledge, suddenly the throne shakes. So what does Indra do? He sends one of his apsaras to distract the rishi, to break his tapas. And you see, in the sadhaka's journey, as this higher capacity or intuitive knowledge begins to dawn, the intellect opposes it. It teases you, or it offers you some seductive attraction, or there is your emotional nature which pops up and tries to divert or break with some pull of desire, which says, but here I will not get that. I'm going to lose this, or this is more attractive. And if the rishi's attention is diverted, momentarily he loses his focus and he must begin his tapas again. And so on, the stories go. But you see how symbolically they describe deep psychological truths and processes. But in the popular form in which they appear, Svarga now becomes the domain of the normal human mental activity, and Indra is just that, the center of the intellect. So the lesser Svarga of the Puranas is not what is referred to by the term here, or the lesser Brahmaloka of the Mundaka Upanishad. Now remember, Isha and Kena are the Upanishads representing the closest from the Veda. Later are also the Mundaka, which have similar vocabulary, but already there is a dilution. In the Mundaka Upanishad, there is the world of the sun's rays in which the soul arrives. How? By works of virtue and piety. If you're a good person, you will grow into this realm of Svarga, and in the light of the sun, a higher consciousness. But when the power which brought you there is exhausted, then you fall. Falls from them by the exhaustion of their merit. So comes this strange idea that you have to build merit in order to ascend. If you lose merit, well, you will fall. But this is not the spiritual dimension. It is some part of the more refined, purified, or the domain which we may describe as virtuous consciousness. As long as I have built up my piety, I am in a virtuous state. There is a kind of a light, a kind of a freedom which comes in the mind, but it doesn't last, and I have to continue this piety. Now this sense of the svarga with the fall, the patala, the fall into the darkness, and the balance between these two is common to this domain. In the journey of the soul after leaving the body, there is a passage through this domain where we have the experience of the heavens and hells, so to say, as states of consciousness. The things we conceive of as our high, beautiful states, and the things which create for us the sadness, the conflicts, and the guilts are experienced as objective or mixed subjective, objective worlds and experiences. And those are the heavens and hells which are described in many of these later traditions as so much more important than the highest. Even in the Buddhist tradition, you will find these ideas and descriptions of the heavens and hells, much more so in the Abrahamic traditions. But if you have stopped with that and made that your heaven, then your hell is as important as the heaven. But if you see these as only an intermediate passage of the vital and mental worlds, the true spirituality being beyond, then you are not deceived and you do not focus on these. You go straight to that which is your home. So he says it's not these lesser Brahma Loka of the Mundaka Upanishad. It is the higher Svarga or Brahma Loka of the Katha, which is beyond the dual symbols of birth and death. The higher Brahman worlds of the Mundaka, which the soul enters by knowledge and renunciation. So we'll explore this a little more next time. And it is therefore a state not belonging to the ignorance but to knowledge. And it is a state of infinite beatitude and an all blissful experience, which he will further describe. So we can pause here, dwelling upon this overall sense of the journey which the Kena prepares us for and leads us to. And we will reread that one sentence where Sri Aurobindo summarizes all the 3 stages of the journey, and we can meditate on it for a few minutes. It is by these means, by using works and self-discipline for mastery of oneself and for the generation of spiritual energy, by fathoming in all its parts the knowledge and repeating the high example of the great Vedic seers, and by living in the truth, that one becomes capable of the great ascent which the Upanishad opens to us. The goal of the ascent is the world of the true and the vast existence, of which the Veda speaks as the truth, that is the final goal and the home of man.